If you haven't already booked your seat for the End of COVID Summit, make sure you do it now. The End of COVID features 90 videos, from short films to interviews to long-form presentations. It's like a podcast combined with an online class, since all of the content is organised into 10 different learning modules. With this educational experience, we can end the next scamdemic before it starts, by unlearning everything we were told to believe about our health and the history of so-called contagions. To start streaming for free, just go to theendofcovid.com/ref/346. All right, welcome to this episode of Truthiverse, and this week I'm joined by Troy McLachlan, who is the author of the Saturn Death Cult, which is a very interesting piece of work. His research is very fascinating. So I'm stoked to have Troy on to discuss his work in this realm. And without me blathering about it, I'm going to just ask the man himself how he got into this arena, what it's about, how you got started. Troy, welcome, and do jump in.
Is all mine. Thanks very much for having me on your show.
Pleasure.
Yeah, Brendan, I basically Saturn Death Cult was written as a result of quite a few years of looking into alternative cosmological theories that a lot of people trace back to Velikovsky. And my own experience with the world of Velikovsky, which I've got to say at the outset, things have moved on since his day, but he's kind of the pioneering father of a lot of the concepts that people like me, take up as far as his cosmological history goes. At Auckland University, I majored in Egyptology, and my experience there with the Egyptologist when asking about Velikovsky was one of total hostility towards the man, which I would later find out as a result of his sort of being put out as a heretic out of the science community and so on like that. All it did was make me more interested. That kind of hostility tends to sort of go, well, there might be something I might want to have a look at it. It was an innocent question at the time. He could have gone one way or the other, and I would have probably believed him, but the hostility was what sort of put me into that kind of research. And many years later, when I was I've been following these kinds of studies all the way through since university. I moved to Hong Kong, lived there for 15 years, back to New Zealand for a while. I'm now in the UK, but I wrote the book Saturn Death Cult about 11 years ago. It's in its second version now, edition, which is much more complete. The first edition was pretty much a first draft of these concepts, but it was really a reaction because I was seeing a lot of people in the alternative research world, looking at aspects of mythology, looking at aspects of physics. And I thought that there was a definite chance to alert people to a theory that seemed to fit what many of these people were saying was noticeable aspects of past history in terms of the human experience and in terms of the cosmological templates or theories that they have for how it works. And I felt that many of them were not quite, it was like they were discovering that there was something about the planet Saturn that looms very large in mythology in its place that is at odds with where Saturn is now in terms of the naked eye visualization of where Saturn is. Why was this planet so prominent in mythology? And that crossed over to other researchers, people like Joseph P. Farrell and so on, who connect a lot of the stuff in mythology to what's actually going on in our modern day society, how this has affected the socio-economic, political realms. And for me, putting out a theory that's called Saturn theory in a subset, which is a subset of the electric universe paradigm of cosmology. The idea was to show that there is a definite link in how socio-economic political events have transpired over the last 5,000 years to what is related to us through mythology, if you have a key about the role that the planet Saturn played the very natural role. By that I mean naturalist role of Saturn's influence on what mythology was, and this is one of the reasons why I felt it was important to get this connection that shows that mythology is more than how most people think of mythology as that, you know, a bunch of fairy tales, made up stuff that, you know, at best psychological crutches that people use that inform their religions at a later date and so on. But it's become a byword for fairy tales, for made up stories, not to be taken seriously as a part of history. And this is my attempt to give an alternative understanding of that shows mythology is actually the written record of some very, very real events that have taken place within the living memory of the human species.
Yeah, that's a great overview. So it started with Velikovsky. The hostility of the professor, you know, piqued your interest, and you felt like you had to look into this, and took it from there.
Yeah, over many years, it was just something I kept coming back to. You know, there were many other influences. You run the whole gambit. You know, there was a time when I looked at Hollow Earth. There was a time that I looked at, you know, various other theories and so on. But what solidified everything was that much later, it was the work of people like Dave Talbot, Eduardo Cardona through the electric universe paradigm, the guys over at thunderbolts.org with their, you know, sort of insights that we live in an electric universe, that where electrical influences are far more influential than the, you know, gravity only driven model of modern physics.
Yep.
And you know, but there is also the very real, most of the guys over at Thunderbirds and so on don't really look at the socioeconomic impacts this has had on our modern society. And, you know, if there is anything I would like people to go away from when they read my book, is that they've got a key to understanding how symbols and archetypes can be manipulated for, you know, what's the word? Well, there's a lot of malfeasance behind the use of symbols and archetypes in the modern world. And essentially, the book argues that this has all led to the successful implementation of what I call the central banking model of international debt finance, which is one of the most destructive aspects of modern society, and has led, you know, especially in the 20th century, to the various wars and so on. It's that old saying that the love of money is the root of all evil. It's an old biblical saying that it's very apt. And central banking and its interest system is very much that thing that we must deal with in order to solve so many of the problems that we have in the world today. But those that perpetuate it are solidly are experts at using archetypes and symbols to herd people into actions that they would never fall for otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, the last 3 years is probably a good example of that, I imagine.
Yeah, I've had a surge of interest when the pandemic hit, because of this idea that there will be an attempt to create another doomsday event, the one that brought down, and I say this would go into details of the book, but the book being largely about two golden ages, a mythical golden age that was destroyed by a doomsday event that created all the archetypal scarring that stalks the human psyche, the collective human psyche, and the down through centuries where those that would like to return to a golden age are attempting to, how can I put this? It's the idea that they want to trigger a new golden age by a new doomsday event. So you get a kind of a symmetry of history, golden age, loss of golden age, period building up to new doomsday that ushers a new golden age. But this is a golden age that will be run by elites with their technologies, their idea of transhumanism as the basis of where the human species should go under their command, if you know what I mean. Let's say, this is what I'm hoping most people sort of cotton onto. And I think when the pandemic hit, it panicked a lot of people, and a sudden interest happened where anybody who had said this might be a factor, this might be part of an attempt, a global culling or something, became very interested in these topics. And so, yeah, there's been a bit of a surge in interest again.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe if it's possible, we could backtrack a bit, and maybe I'd like to start with, I feel like what to me it seems like the foundational aspect of this, which is Saturn in the sky. Cosmologically, what's going on, what was happening to create the trauma that you're talking about, and then the subsequent influence on mythology and so forth down the ages. I mean, what was going on in the sky?
Right. Well, I think the best way to, this goes back to my experience with the professor at university and so on. Generally speaking, in the modern age, the way mythology describes the planets as gods and where they were sitting, what their influences were, is so at odds with where we see them today that they can't conceive of there being any sort of reality behind what was being reported. But if we take it at face value, the ancients were reporting a sky that was exceedingly, almost totally different to the one that we see today. So we've always known about what's called the 5 naked eye planets, and Saturn is one of them. But Saturn is a pinprick on the edge of the solar system that, until Renaissance times, we supposedly had no idea had rings even. It was only the invention of the telescope that allowed people to see that Saturn had rings. And yet Saturn in mythology is the supreme god archetype. And we know from the Greeks, Aristotle and from Plato and so on, but particularly Aristotle, that the wandering stars, the 5 naked eye planets, were the gods of mythology. In other words, there was a connection between these luminous objects and the stories that are centered on these mythical god figures. And this is where it becomes interesting for people who understand what Carl Jung, with his concepts of human psychological archetypes and so on like that. This is where you can look into mythology and see that the way that the gods are portrayed is very much an archetype on the human, the human psyche, and that the planet Saturn loomed so large in their understanding of its role, of what was going on in the heavens, that it seems almost farcical, given our current solar system makeup, the configuration that we have today. It seems preposterous that these people were making a connection with the actual planet, Saturn, at that time. Yet that's exactly what they say they were doing. And up until about 2,500 years ago, the most important thing that humans were doing on the planet was watching the skies. And the reason for that was basically an event called Doomsday, and multiple events after that, that radically changed what happened on the planet for human existence at a time that is linked to the demise of the god Saturn. So where Saturn theory comes into this is the idea that the Earth was originally a satellite of a brown dwarf star that would later on become the planet Saturn, and that brown dwarf star with its satellites, which would have included Mars, was captured by the sun in a highly catastrophic event witnessed by human beings that radically changed the world from a primordial sort of eternal duskiness to this golden age of brilliance, where Saturn, the god, the bringer of light, loomed large in the northern celestial realms of the planet, ultimately to fall from that position and be banished to the outer parts of the solar system. Of course, to mainstream science, this is preposterous. But this is what mythology says. And so if you take them at their word, and I'll just give a quote here. I always give this in interviews because I think it sums up things perfectly. It's Eduardo Cardona. He's one of the top guys who pioneered Saturn theory after Velikovsky. He was part of Velikovsky's inner circle. He was kind of fell out with Velikovsky, went on to his own work. And he's the man that I tend to sort of refer to in terms of the more scientific cosmological ideas. But this is his quote, and I'll read it. Quote, "The evidence of myth which points to Saturn having once occupied a position above Earth's north polar regions is voluminous. There is not a race on Earth that has not preserved at least one account which states as much. According to this evidence, Saturn occupied a central position in the north celestial regions. It rotated and rotated widely, but other than that, it was immovable. Now, the doomsday event that has scarred humanity is what brought that to an end. It's what displaced Saturn's position, according to that interpretation of mythology, and put the world into the current sort of scarcity model that we have in the current environment. So we, in making this interpretation that the mythologists, the people who created mythology, the various mythologies around the world, and this is a powerful factor, all these different cultures have a similar story. They express it differently, but it's a very, very similar story. And people have tried to say it's spread from a central point, but we know that that doesn't work very well. That what we should be seeing is they all saw the same thing and expressed it differently according to their cultures. So Saturn theory is that, it behooves us in Saturn theory to provide a cosmological explanation for how that could have happened, that this planet could have been up there, that it glowed like a sun. Like the alchemist said, Saturn was our first sun and the best sun that we ever had, way before this current sun. You find this repeated in many times in various world cultures. So comparative mythology is a very strong aspect of finding out what they saw, believing what they saw, and now trying to provide an actual physics and cosmology that can explain what they saw.
Yeah, beautiful. And the thing is that they didn't, as you've already kind of alluded to, these ancient peoples, they didn't simply, they weren't arbitrary. They didn't just manufacture a fairy tale to, entertain themselves or to comfort themselves, like one of these crutches you mentioned. They weren't arbitrary like that at all. They were actually documenting things in their own style and their own way. And I recently, not long ago, I interviewed Patrick, whose surname escapes me right now, but a professor who's been doing some great work into these ancient cultures around the world and the way that they documented events in relation to sea levels. And they've actually correlated all these different accounts and stories, so-called fables, and actually shown that they correlate with the different sea levels, much lower sea levels as they would have been back then. So a bunch of different cultures around the world, they've actually proved that their reports are not arbitrary and they're not figurative. They're actually literally accounting what's happening in the world around them, which is something that we're still in the mainstream world trying to get our heads around. So yeah, I just wanted to add to that. There's plenty of evidence to support the kind of thinking that you're outlining here.
Yeah, so basically what you're doing is you're establishing something through a basis of most people's approach to truth through multiple witness accounts. Yeah. Do they agree with each other? In legal terms, when you get multiple witnesses, if their stories diverge all over the place, something's wrong and somebody's not telling the truth. But when the stories are given in separate accounts, and there is a merging of likeness in the stories, that you're getting to something of the truth as to what happened. And in this case, separate cultures are the multiple witnesses that are pointing to a very different past, a very different cosmological past, to what the uniformitarian dogma of today's science tells us took place. But you see, it's that uniformitarian thing that we've all been taught in school. That's billions of years old. Everything happens slowly. It's increments that are hardly noticed and so on. And even if we had situations described in mythology as they are, mankind couldn't possibly have been around at these times. They were too far into the past. And when you have that, you get a phenomenon where people start to interpret mythology where it doesn't match what we see today. So the mistake is uniformitarian science works on the principle that what we see today is the key to what happened in the past. Right? It's the idea of that you can get that key. But this is a flawed idea in terms of telling what the past is, particularly doing retro calculations of planets and things, asteroids, comets, all this sort of stuff. This retro idea doesn't actually tell you the point when these things exploded into life, it's like the old story. If you see a satellite that's been launched in 1960 or 1964 going around the Earth and so on, if you know it was launched in 1964, yeah, you know how it happens. But if you just see it and you say, when did that launch? You'll never be able to retro calculate its launch date based on its current movements. And this is what modern science has convinced everybody we should do for virtually everything that is historical, despite the mythological record and what it says. And so they contrive. Dave Talbot, one of the great Saturn theory comparative mythologists in Saturn theory thinking, he points to John J. O'Neill, the great academic from the Victorian era, who just couldn't reconcile what mythology was saying about Saturn with what he saw in the sky. So he literally created the situation where modern scholarship, wherever you see Saturn worship, they automatically put it onto sun worship because of the dominance of the sun that you have today. So you get a complete misidentification. So we're told these people were sun worshippers all the time. But when you look at the archetype of the sun god, it's the Saturn archetype that is prevalent in all mythologies, whether it's Baal or whether it's Ra in Egypt or even the Ra of the Polynesians and so on. This is an archetype that is consistent with the Saturn archetype, not with the soul sun archetype. But modern academia says it has to conform with that. And I would add that anybody who looks at mythology as it's presented today, we have films, Hollywood films, Clash of the Titans. They portray mythology as a psychodrama, where gods are portrayed as just simply human beings with immortal status, and they all have the same fallibilities and so on. And these stories that we often take as, do you know the mythology of Greece? Do you know the mythology of Rome? Do you know the mythology of Egypt and so on? A lot of this is the interpretation of people who have tried to reconcile sun worship into the mythological record that they're studying. So they create these psychodramas, whereas if you look at the original texts and languages, it's a madhouse. Okay, so they've effectively been editing mythology to make it more narrative friendly in terms of its stories, than looking at it and saying, this is data. All right, they don't see it as data because it doesn't match our skies today. However, if you can find a way to posit how Saturn could have once glowed as our sun in the celestial north, you're on your way to discovering things about mythology that not only frees you in an understanding of our past, but in my opinion, definitely helps sort of, how can I put it? It's a wonderful way of leaving superstition behind and moving forward with intellectual knowledge, a gnosis, so to speak, of events in the past, as opposed to superstitious ideas. And in that way, it's a direct challenge to many of the world's major religions in their current form.
Yeah, which we'll get to. Hopefully, we'll have time to get to that because that's rich. As far as the the events in the sky, can you give us a little bit of time frame and the background as to what was happening? Was there a lead up to it? What were the solar solar system dynamics in play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I provide a chronological sort of rundown in my book Saturn Death Cult at the bottom, because for many people it's understanding just how different this approach changes history, particularly the history of our solar system, the natural history of our solar system. But up until I would estimate about 20,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago, about 20,000 years ago, and you can't be, I would say it's unfortunate in our circle of people who study Saturn Death Cult, there are people who are trying to nail down these dates to the day and the hour, with a Gregorian calendar approach to it and so on. And when you're sort of talking about such massive changes in solar system configuration, this I think is impossible. But what I, as a broad thumbnail outline, Earth was a satellite with a brown dwarf star that was in a free-floating brown dwarf star in interstellar space, of which there could be up to 7,000 of these things between us and the next nearest star, according to some accounts. Very difficult to optically see because they don't glow, and they create a plasma sheath around them that makes them virtually invisible except for infrared and radio astronomy and so on. And when you have to be specifically looking for those signatures to find that, and modern science isn't interested in looking for those signatures. They're looking for exoplanets around stars like our main sequence star. Mm-hmm. So Earth is under this, Earth is part of this system under a brown dwarf star that is captured at around about 12,000 BC. 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, using that sort of figure. And as a result of that capture, the brown dwarf star explodes into a light. It basically fissions. It has a nova-like experience. And the result of that is that whatever is living on its satellites, one of them being Earth, is the environment on those satellites is radically changed, and you get what a mythology refers to the launching of a golden age. It starts catastrophically. It would have been an extinction event for quite a few species and so on. Humans seem to have survived, and they tell us of the Walt Thornhill, who's passed away now, one of our top theorists in this. He dubbed it the purple dawn of creation. There was a time when humans lived in a perpetual duskiness. You couldn't calculate time. There was nothing out there to reference celestially to basically be able to measure time. When this explodes, everything changes. Suddenly, humans have access to the greater cosmos, and the light that it brings and the transparency to the rest of the cosmos brings about the beginning of being able to calculate time. And this is the fundamental change in the human experience, this ability to now calculate time, and why the Saturn god archetype is associated with time. Mm-hmm. Greek chronos, chronometer, and so on like that. So this beginning of the golden age is a beginning when humans now have the concept of weights and measures that is brought about by this change in environment. And they enter into this golden age of, basically the golden age is a lack of want. There's eternal harvests going on around the planet. As a result of the changes, there is it's a golden age of exploration and meeting up and finding things, and different cultures starting to develop. But central to it is the acknowledgement that it's only possible because this capture event by the sun that later we find out explodes Saturn into a glowing ball that changes life on Earth. In the meantime, you've got this other light that you can now see on the eastern horizon that seems to be getting bigger and bigger down through the Golden Age. And by about 6000 BC, the effect of that, which is, of course, the sun is approaching it, destroys the relationship between Earth and Saturn. It displaces Saturn, and the Earth undergoes a doomsday event of magnitude, near extinction event for humanity, for a lot of people, a lot of species on the planet. And there is a chaotic period where all these planetary bodies that people could see, Mars, the newly birthed Venus, which we can get into later how that comes about, they're all displaced. And this chaotic period is deadly dangerous for people on Earth because of near events where various bodies, Mars, Venus and such, come into close proximity with Earth, create all kinds of interplanetary destructive events and such. And it doesn't settle down until about 2,500 years ago fully. About the time of the biblical Exodus, which is where Velikovsky comes into the picture, where he put that down to a close pass with Venus and so on. It's about that time that the Earth settles into what you would call modern recorded history. But over time, people lose because the skies become placid, people lose the connection with what was going on before and how dangerous it was during this capture moment when Saturn was displaced as Earth's original sun. So yeah, 12,000 years ago is, I put it down to the capture, the beginning of a golden age that displaces the purple dawn of creation, which goes back into time. I don't know how far back, no one can know. About 8,000 years, 6,000 years later, could be as long as 8,000, but 6,000 years ago is the massive doomsday event that sets up the whole aspect of where we are as a collective species in terms of our psyche, in terms of understanding our past, the effects that things have had on us from our past, and how they have continued to affect us down through to the modern age. That doomsday event was probably the biggest event in human history in terms of what has been related in mythology, bigger than anything that we've had, Second World War, nothing compared to this. And so 6,000 years ago, the Earth enters into this new environment, and you have a sequence of ages, Silver Age, Bronze Age, or Heroic Age, into the now modern Iron Age that the esoteric traditions talk about. We are in that modern Iron Age period that kind of starts about 2,500 years ago. Not to be confused with the scientific demarcation, Stone Age, Bronze Age, that sort of stuff. This is purely esoteric thinking as to where mankind is spiritually, psychologically, in relation to his environment, in relation to what's happened in the heavens. And 6,000 years ago, it kicks off that, what I call decline, that descent into, slavery, warfare, some of the most atrocious and some of the greatest atrocities ever committed by humans against other humans. And it's all to do with what happened 6,000 years ago, a doomsday event, and the subsequent behavior of human beings in relation to that event.
What was the, because this is obviously got a huge psychological component to it. So when this earth-shaking trauma occurred, what do you think, just to flesh it out, if we can pull on those psychological threads a little bit, what led to then, these people who must have been, everybody basically scared out of their minds, at least for some period of time. And then, this period of, as you said, this period of violence, which probably had not existed up to that point in time. Just to sort of walk us through that, your ideas around that.
Well, what happens with the doomsday event is the Earth undergoes a transformation in terms of its environment, where seasonality becomes a factor of life on Earth. There's a massive change. The poles cover over with ice. There are no longer the sort of eternal harvests worldwide that they were experiencing during the Golden Age. And so scarcity becomes an issue for human survival. Now, the Golden Age in the immature spiritual mind is an age where you get to kick back, the fish jump into your frying pan. You just need to reach up to this eternal low-hanging fruit. You don't have to worry about where you get your next meal. All right. Right up to the modern day, since the Doomsday event, that's been the preeminent concern of every human on this planet. When do I get my next meal? We create economies designed to provide that next meal consistently to us. And when things go wrong, we go to war with each other to defend our access to our next meal, as opposed to somebody else's access to the next meal. So scarcity is the massive change that takes place. What happens after the Doomsday thing, though, is that the Saturn God archetype undergoes a transformation as well. It goes from being the benevolent creator of life as we know it, not life itself, but life as we know it, in the sense of a bright light, and alluded to before in this Golden Age era, a wonderful time of exploration in every aspect, physical, spiritual, everything about it was opened up. People, could measure things and work things out in ways they never could before. And so Saturn is associated with rules, laws, weights and measures. All right, weights and measures become the means by which humans deal with each other, particularly strangers who meet up. It's the weights and measures that are the glue for being able to trust people, which comes back to something that is very prevalent in today's world. This is why it is so, I believe, so important for the modern person to understand these things, because its relevance is that in the Golden Age, true justice is achieved. Everybody respects the weights and measures, and they are enforced in such a way that everybody knows they will get justice if they feel they are wronged. Okay. The original Silver Age priesthoods that try to preserve that justice, those weights and measures, they are the basis of what would become the priesthoods of the major religions over time. But you see, what happens is that as you get humans living less years than they did, somebody pointed out to me that the gravity was probably much less during the Golden Age. People lived longer lives because you didn't have that gravitational pull on the system that people have today. That tends to sort of wear and tear us out.
And also there was a lot of talks of much larger humans, giants on the Earth in those days.
Absolutely, yeah. So long-lived giants, this sort of thing. I mean, just even the creatures that we dig up were bigger. My erstwhile author Ted Holden, he wrote the seminal piece on the impossible dinosaurs. How in this gravitational environment they can't survive. They couldn't survive. So much so that when they were first discovered, people thought that they were wading creatures because that's the only way you could actually support themselves. We know that when a whale beaches, it ultimately suffocates itself under its own weight if it doesn't have buoyancy. And yet these things walked around on the Earth, and they were enormous. So there had to have been a lower gravity. And Ted puts the gravity of Earth during the time when Saturn was its main sun, he would put it down to only 2/3 of what it is today.
Wow.
Yeah, so that you can imagine how much stronger we'd be. And just little things start to make sense. The megalithic stuff that we see from ancient cultures, the ability to move rocks that are immensely heavy by today's standards, were probably a little bit easier under these conditions, and so on. So anyway. Yeah, sorry,
I'll just briefly interject. Hold that thought. I want you to continue. Just for anyone listening, just to reiterate the gravity thing, particularly if you go and look at the Thunderbolts research, which is extensive, they explain gravity as an electromagnetic phenomenon. Okay, so for anyone out there who's kind of fallen into this trap of, gravity skeptics, we'll call them, it's an electromagnetic thing. So you don't even have to think of it as a separate force unto itself. I don't want to waste any time on that stuff, but it's electrical primarily. So go on.
I'd only just add that they've made the mistake of creating gravity as a constant, like they did with light.
Yeah.
Light is not a constant. Gravity is not a constant. We know this because the French are going out of their minds with their kilo that they have stuck away. It keeps getting heavier by electrons. Right now, that just to the electric universe guy, that just tells you that our electrical relationship with the sun is variable. And so gravity will be variable at times. It also explains the gravity changes that as Saturn was approaching the sun, it would have undergone lots of electrical changes, near misses, the approach. They would have electrically felt each other out. And this would have had highly detrimental effects to gravity on Earth at that time. And it's quite possible that, going from the giant creatures to the less giant, to the smaller, to the giant mammals to the smaller mammals, it seems that the extinction events were probably related to changes in gravity, sudden changes in gravity based on the electric relationship between Earth and Saturn and ultimately on. But anyway, getting back to what we're saying is that these priesthoods that emerge in what's called the Silver Age period, the first 1,000 years after the great cataclysm, doomsday event, amongst these people, they look back on the Golden Age, and this is very much the sentiment that you see in the modern elites today, and they think to themselves, "Gee, they had it good. I'd like to have it good. You know what? If I could get everybody else to do the work." And they have to give me the product of their labors, I can live like somebody used to live in the Golden Age. No worries about food and so on like that. And I always point to for those people who have a biblical reference, I come from a biblical background and so on. The catastrophic doomsday event that we're talking about is represented in biblical studies by the fall from the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is the Golden Age period. All right, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The fall is the biblical version of the catastrophic doomsday event. And the consequence of that fall is specified that by the sweat of your brow, you will make the earth yield its fruits. They never had to worry about that before, you see? So these people don't want to put sweat on their brow. They want other people's brows to get sweaty, digging out the fruits of the earth. So, and then they want to tax that for themselves. And there's only a couple of effective ways of doing this. You can either use the threat of violence. You will go out in the fields and work for me. And if you don't, I'll kill you. All right. But that only works to a certain level. The average bloke, no matter how tough he is, can probably only put stand over a group of people no more than 11, 12 or whatever like that. At some point, they're always going to rebel against that kind of force. And so you have to look to a way that you can enslave people without people knowing they are being enslaved. And the way to do that is to ultimately convince people that you are the voice of the God that ruled during the Golden Age. You have his authority to be able to determine what the weights and measures are. And then there's a short skip there where you have one set of weights and measures that you work by and one set of weights and measures that other people are subjected to, that ensures that you have a take of what they do. And the threat of divine retribution is what hangs over people rather than the threat of immediate violence. Okay. And so control mechanisms become the objective of a lot of these corrupted priesthoods who look for ways to make sure that the priesthood and the people who back up the priesthood get the bulk of the wealth generated by the bulk of the population, and that the bulk of the population never wakes up and goes, why am I doing this and giving it all to you?
Yeah.
Why don't you do a bit of work with us? And so on like that. So that's what I believe starts the whole process and is ultimately refined. And whether people like it or not, to me, central banking is a quasi-religious concept. It is a form of temple tax that has, they even build their buildings to look like temples. The three entrances, all these things that come from ancient temples and so on. They have that there. They stick all these symbols and incantations all over their money and so on, which is completely pointless. Really, in terms of what money functions as. Why do you need all these symbols stuffed all over money and so on like that? Because it triggers people into thinking that they must be in charge, because a deep psychological scar says whoever talks for Saturn and so on is the person in charge. And we've got to be careful, because Saturn, went crazy at one point, decided to wipe out the whole of humanity. And so we've got to keep him happy and such. And that's the psychological scar that these people work on.
And so this, I just want to recap. So this would be, I guess, where a large part of, offerings to the gods comes in, to trying to placate the god or gods. And this timeline, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you said 6,000 years ago is when the Doomsday event happened?
Correct, yeah.
And so just to tie this into Christian thought, because they're still, approximately.
Yeah,
So this was when we were, ejected from the Garden of Eden, so to speak. And this was the beginning of the, if you like, the earth as we know it, the creation of the earth as we know it.
Seasonal change.
Yeah. Because that 6,000, figure is very prominent in the Christian psyche, particularly the fundamentalist branches. They literally talk about the world not existing prior to the 6,000 year timeline. Like there's nothing. That was when it was created.
Yeah, and yet that's not what the Bible actually says. It's very clear that there was a void before, and that void is a very bad translation for what all the other mythologies talk about, the purple dust dawn, because it talks about the Spirit of God floating. I'm paraphrasing here for people who sort of biblical fundamentalists, but I'm just giving the basic idea that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the ocean. Okay, now that ocean should not be confused with the water oceans of earth. That ocean was a celestial ocean that existed before the advent of in the Bible, it's called the let there be light moment.
Yeah.
All right. So the capture of earth by the sun that explodes Saturn into this ball of light that brings about this whole concept of the calculation of time and so on. That's your let there be light moment in the Bible. But prior to that is this, it conforms with all the other mythologies. There's this darkened period. And if you go into other parts of other texts in the Bible, particularly in Jeremiah, also in Ezekiel, you find that there's a consistency. You can wheedle out of it that humans existed at this time as well. They just didn't exist in covenant relationship with the God that is associated with bringing about the change of the earth, the let there be light moment. But there were humans running around. And this is one of my big bugbears with Christianity. The Bible is very clear that there were other humans around before Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve is not the first humans. They are the first humans in a relationship with the biblical God as it's portrayed. We know this, and it's crazy because people just overlook so much. Cain is crapping himself, all right, after he kills his brother. Now think about it. There's only supposed to be Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, all right, but Cain is worried about what these other people are going to do to him because he murdered his brother. And so God creates this thing called the mark of Cain. And the mark of Cain is not a physical mark. It is a bounty that will be put on any group of humans that hunt down Cain to take justice on them for killing his brother. In other words, there had to be other people around for the Lord to say, I will take, I think it's 30 or 12. I can't remember what the actual number is, but it's certainly more than just Adam and Eve. You know, the next brother, Seth, isn't even born at this stage. So the fact that he goes to another part of the planet, he meets up with somebody, gets married, he's in the land of Nod and all this sort of stuff, and he's worried about people, and he needs God's assurance that if they come after him, he'll take retribution on them for killing Cain. Why? Biblically speaking, because there was only one witness and two witnesses are required. So God was the only witness, and you can only establish a crime with two or more witnesses. So he was protecting him on that basis, which implies that there were other people around. So yes, from a Christian point of view, okay, the let there be light moment is about 12,000 years in the past, and the fall from Eden is about 6,000 years, and that comports very nicely with most of the other mythological timelines. I think it's important when I reference the celestial ocean in terms of the biblical reference and how that relates into Saturn theory, is this understanding of Earth as a satellite of a brown dwarf star in a free-floating interstellar space environment before its capture by the sun. What's postulated in the electric universe model is that when the electrical field of that brown dwarf star is out in free-floating space, it will create an opaque plasma sheath, a Langmuir sheath, which is part of the whole process of, electrical engineers will know what I'm talking about by the way electricity fields can create these kind of fields, these sheaths.
Yeah.
Let's say a Langmuir sheath, we call them plasma sheaths or plasma bubbles.
Yeah.
And if you're inside that plasma bubble, not only does the light from your host brown dwarf star bounce around to create a uniform light on whatever satellites are revolving around that brown dwarf star, the result of that is also that you have a very dusky environment because no starlight is getting in. You're not seeing the stars outside because it's being blocked by a roiling plasma sheath, and that has its own property, and it looks like the ocean. So for people on the planet standing on the shore of an ocean, and so as they look to what we would call the horizon, it continues into this plasma sheath. So you get almost a sort of an overlapping effect. So the ocean becomes one with the skies, with the ocean, in terms of the way that they've envisaged this. And somewhere unknown to them, but at what would have been the celestial north of Earth, its northern point, if you read the book, it goes from phase lock. The Earth goes from phase lock around this brown dwarf to being swept under as the brown dwarf is being pulled into the sun at increasing speeds. But there's always this. What happens is that Saturn, this glowing red brown dwarf, from the Earth's perspective, seems to be immobile in the same spot of the sky, doing nothing. It's a pale disk that just sits there, and you can't see anything else because of this roiling ocean. So that's of plasma. That is the ocean that the Spirit in Genesis is hovering over, because the let there be light moment happens when Saturn, the brown dwarf star that will become Saturn, when its electrical field becomes overwhelmed by contact with the sun's much stronger electrical field, it short circuits. And what happens at that point is the host star, the brown dwarf, will fission and lose all of that plasma sheath will be equalized by the sun's own electric field, and it will be almost in an instant will be made transparent. So the let there be light moment is, it literally takes, it's about 2 or 3 hour experience in the history of the Earth of transformation, which when you come out at the end of it, things are so radically changed. There's these little bright dots where a roiling plasma ocean had been. That pale disk is suddenly a bright glowing ball. And there's all this debris that takes on it's ejected matter, most of it water, that takes on the effect of looking like some kind of giant serpent, wrapping itself around what had been this dull disk that was now glowing. They look like they're in battle, and so on, and, to the point that all this debris looks like it obscures the sun, the Saturn and its glowing disk. And eventually you also get the phenomenon that the water goes into orbit, around Saturn and produces the famous rings. Okay, and for this launches the golden age, and this is the rings are what ultimately lead to the connection between the Saturn archetype and the horned god of old religion, where so many gods are represented with horns, with a solar disk between the horns, whether it's Baal or even the Tengrist peoples of the steppe lands, these sorts of things. It's that idea of something which is a horn. And the reason for that is that when the rings appear and the plasma bubble is made transparent, the effect of the sun's distant light, still distant light, is enough to cast a shadow onto the rings. And because Saturn is rotating and the Earth is rotating, but the sun is not rotating at this point round slowly, it's just coming in until it gets to a point where it starts to begin the rotation. From Earth's perspective, the rings look like they're circling round because you've got that reference where the shadow of Saturn on its rings is turning. From our perspective, it's just a relative observation from the Earth's perspective. But that shadow creates a horn-like look round the face of God, so to speak, which becomes the solar disk of the horned god that we know from mythology. And you know, this is the almost unfathomable vision that people had of the heavens after this particular time, up to the time of, for biblical people, being cast out of the Garden of Eden and being subjected to this doomsday event where everything falls apart. Quite literally, that configuration of planets falls apart. What's preposterous to most people is to create that effect, you have to have Earth in axial alignment, polar alignment with Saturn for that to happen. And for many physicists, this is just, it's just too much. There's no way you're going to get that, and so on. But there is a way you're going to get that, and it has been observed. We've seen it with the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet when it broke up before hitting Jupiter. What was that, 99, 97? I can't remember when it happened. There, yeah. Somewhere around about there, late 90s, all right? It broke up into 22 fragments that then arranged themselves into linear fashion, all right? So they were spinning on an axis, and they were strung out. It was called the string of pearls, all right, that they had. And it circles Jupiter, and it eventually crashes into Jupiter in that configuration. Now, Jupiter is a mini solar system in its own right, and as some people describe it that way, and in my opinion was itself a brown dwarf star in way primordial times. But if that could happen at that scale, then Saturn's approach and eventual tearing up with the sun, it could be done at the bigger scale of planetary bodies, brown dwarf stars with its satellites. We also see linear systems are actually ubiquitous right throughout the universe. They're called Big Harrow systems, and science has yet been able to. They call it a jet, a plasma, a gaseous jet. But jets do not maintain their integrity like water out of a hose pipe, jetting out of a hose pipe does in atmosphere. It's the atmosphere that keeps that water together as it jets. All right. It's the same thing with gas. If you're in a near vacuum environment of space, it'll just dissipate. It won't keep that jet-like consistency that spans light years in some cases, phenomenal amounts of time. But that's all turning in a polar axial alignment and maintaining itself. And in the electric universe, we say there's only one force in the universe that can create that phenomenon. That's electrical forces. It's not gravity. It's not gravity that by itself that is doing that. So there's plenty to show that this axial alignment to produce Saturn at the Earth's celestial north is very much a feature of what can be achieved when one understands the physics of the electric universe model. So going on from that, in speaking about connections with the Bible and so on, that takes us into how world religions ultimately form from these events as they were, And why, for many Christians, it's a bit of a revelation to find out not only that Adam and Eve were not, according to the Bible, the first people on the earth, but it also brings into question the domineering and dominant concept that it is a world religion that must be applied to all. And, you know, it's the same goes for the other three major, the other two Abrahamic religions. All right. It's this idea that if Adam and Eve were the first humans on the planet, then everybody is subject to that God who made Adam and Eve. But if they are not the first humans on the planet, then the Bible becomes a record of a legal agreement made between the descendants of those two people, separate to the other peoples who were existent at the time of the planet. But that does not work well for people who are looking for domination, world domination. Because to be able to say, you're under me because I represent God, I'm the voice of God on earth, and God made you and all as a descendant of the first humans that he made. So by descent from Adam and Eve, you're under our authority. That works well for a control mechanism that is seeking global dominance. All right. Whereas the true Silver Age, what I call Melchizedekian priesthoods and so on that come out from that, their priority is simply to reestablish a society on earth, all right, that becomes a model for the whole of the earth for justice, based on weights and measures that are revealed by God. That's the biblical concept there. The failure of the people who are designated to undergo that task of being a representative is the story of the Israelite people of the Bible. It's their failure to live up to that agreement. And the story really boils down to the God rescuing such people who he has had a contract with at a later stage to once again bring about the idea of a model of justice on the earth that existed during the Golden Age that was lost as a result of supposedly the sin of Adam and Eve from a biblical perspective. Now, I don't go into that in the Saturn Death Cult stuff, but that is something to keep in mind, especially for those who have a biblical background. If you are reading the book, why that fits in well with the biblical idea, if you can get past the idea of a young earth, 6 days, Adam and Eve created, everybody comes from them, and therefore everybody is subject to, all descendants of Adam and Eve are subject to the agreements stipulated in the Bible.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, so I mean, I've got a few sort of ideas around. Well, there's some ideas you've mentioned that we could flesh out perhaps, but if you want to continue with that line of thinking, or we can go back and revisit some of the things in the sky, the mythological and symbolical aspects, and how that then, like the battle between the serpent and this kind of stuff is so huge. I mean, it's such a global thing. I mean, it's fascinating to hear it broken down like this.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the pure cosmology of Saturn theory. All right. Before you get into how it affected and its connections to the human psyche and our descent, as I call it, into the barbarism of slavery, human sacrifice, and so on, understanding the environment, understanding what these people were looking at. That's why the book is very illustrated, because it's I found that you have to create illustrations to show the concepts, because it's so alien to what modern science tells us happens in space.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So again, just recapping on that, Saturn theory posits that the solar system as we know it today is not a result of a general accretion disk theory where everything that you see today was formed in place and has stayed in that place, and that's been the situation for at least 4 to 5 billion years. What it posits is that our solar system has been reached its current configuration through a process of capture. Lots of rogue elements have been captured into it as part of basically as part of a electrical. No, I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. But basically speaking, the sun starts off with maybe Jupiter and its satellites and then Saturn and its satellites are captured. I haven't worked out Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, what their involvement is. They're not part of the naked eye planets, so nobody knows that. So they have a separate history to work out, which is all part of the process. But most definitely, Saturn and Jupiter are not from the same accretion disk, if you know what I mean. All right, they just that alone puts that to rest in terms of how different they are, the different axial tilts and so on. So we have this, this cosmology that shows Saturn being captured at a time within human memory. That's also the thing that gets most people's minds, working out of themselves, trying to figure out how that figures what they've been taught at school, modern physics and so on. And Saturn theory says that the process that creates the series of captures and destructions and so on is all electrically based. It's basically electrical fields sorting themselves out when they come into direct contact with each other. So there is no worlds in collision like Velikovsky's title suggested. He never suggested that they actually collided or anything, but that essentially their electrical fields bump up against each other, create all kinds of problems for the different planets and such, and then eventually settle down into an equilibrium, which is very recent and can be disturbed at any time. If there's another brown dwarf out there, it may come into contact the same way as Saturn, whether it's got planets or not, and that would be very, very catastrophic for anything that was in that solar system doing that capture. Whether we would survive it is another factor, but the survival of the human species on Earth at this time is nothing short of miraculous, because their world changes, as we've discussed, from this dull purple dawn existence into a world that had bright disk now in its northern horizon, another big light starting to get bigger as it comes in from the west, rings being formed around this light in the sky. But you also have to take into account the two planets that are strung out between Saturn and Earth. One of them is Mars, all right? And the other one is Venus. Now, Venus is postulated in Saturn theory to have been ejected by Saturn as a consequence of its nova-like explosion. So when you get a core of a planet undergoing a fission-like experience, it will fracture these gas giants, these things. And if it fractures, what you effectively have, because they're all magnetized because of the electric current that is flowing through these objects, according to Saturn theory, what you get is effectively two magnets with the same polarization. And the lesser magnet will be repelled, ejected, if you know what I mean. Just if you break a magnet up and so on, the bigger part of the magnet will push away the smaller part of the magnet because of the way things line up. If positive to positive comes together, there's a repulsion force. And so this is how Venus is born. And Venus becomes this beautiful light in the sky that settles under Saturn, just for the sake of argument, settles under Saturn, according to the theory, between Saturn and Mars. But its arrival obliterates Mars. That's why Mars is a scarred warrior, the red planet. I have this debate with a lot of people about Mars and life on it. I believe there was life on Mars, but it was obliterated. A lot of people don't realize that the northern hemisphere of Mars, I think it's 5 kilometers.
This concludes part 1 of the show. You'll find part 2 and related materials in my members-only portal, The Truthiversity, the consciousness-raising university. This creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, videos, blogs, courses, audio files, live internal events, the whole enchilada. Grab yourself a free 24-hour pass at access.truthiversity.com.